welcome to the Spice Rack. I'm Shannon Spicer, and I'd like to add a little spice to your quilting. This is week 8 of my series, the Spicerack Sampler. Our block this week is called the Snail's Trail. It's funny, as I was selecting these blocks, that I found this one goes by different names. It's also called the Monkey Wrench block, but when you search for Monkey Wrench, you often get the Churn Dash block. So I'm calling this one by its other common name, Snail's Trail. You can download a copy of this pattern by following the link below in the description. If you're just now joining in on this series, check out my channel to see the other blocks and tutorials. This is a 12-block series of classic blocks that I'm remaking in a modern way. As I've mentioned throughout this series, these blocks start out really easy and then we build skills as we go. If you've been following along, you know we've learned strip piecing, which we'll use today, and we've learned how to make half square triangles using the 4 at a time method. And last week we learned how to make an economy block, which is also called a square in a square. Today's block is pretty much completely a square in a square with multiple squares in squares. The method I'm going to use this week though is slightly different than last week, and I'll explain and show you why. So let's get started. First, we're going to set the triangles aside. What I'm going to do first is, like I said, what we learned in our very first week, strip piecing. I'm going to sew them together along the long side with a 1/4 inch seam, and then we're going to subcut and make it into a little checkerboard, like we did for the railroad block. Okay, so here's my piece sewn, and I pressed it to the dark side, pressed it open, which will work because then we're going to cut it and rotate and sew it into a checkerboard, and those seams will nest together. Okay, so here we have our two pieces. I'm going to sew them together, right sides together like this, and we'll have a little checkerboard block. Okay, so here we have our checkerboard block. And the reason I had you do a rectangle, then subcut, and then turn and sew into a checkerboard block was so that you didn't have to deal with 4 little pieces of fabric. I try to find the easiest ways to do things as possible. This is now the center of our swirl, our snail's trail block. So next we are going to take a pair of triangles. It's our smallest size, and we will sew them to opposite sides. We're going to sew one here and then flip it open and sew one on this side and flip it open. I just line it up there with the center seam and sew it. Okay, here we have that done. I'm going to now press these open nice and flat and then add cream triangles to the opposite sides. Now what I'm going to do real quick before I attach the cream is I'm going to clean up this side and trim off these little parts that are hanging off. Okay, so now we have our cream triangles, and we'll do the same. Put these on the sides that are not sewn, opposite sides, and sew them 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, so here we have our first square in a square. We've got our center checkerboard square inside this square, but we're going to keep the green on one side and the cream on another so that as they keep extending outward, it will create that spiral. Now the reason I'm not doing this the way I did last week, where we had squares that we placed on opposite sides and we sewed along a line that we drew with a pen, is because for this particular size, to cut those 2 squares would have been a really odd size, and I would rather not have you cut an odd size. With the triangles, we could cut them a little bit bigger. We could round up to make it a nice cuttable size and then sew them this way and press them open and trim it up. With this particular pattern, Each time you add a set of triangles to the side and press open, you're going to make sure you trim it to the size shown in the pattern. Might seem a little tedious because it starts so small. I basically wanted this to be as many squares and squares as possible that I could fit. Because I am doing these with just 2 colors, I wanted to have a bigger design, more layers basically. So now we're going to repeat the process. We're going to take the next pair of triangles, the next size up, and do the same thing and just keep repeating. I'm going to attach this to this side so that when it's pressed open, we can see that this green is starting to extend out in a spiral. I would not want to do it on this side because that's not going the right direction. That would be an opposite spiral. Okay, so I'm going to do it on this side. Whichever side you pick, be consistent. This way my spiral will start to go out toward the right. One thing I will add is when you create the first center square in a square, don't worry if it's a little bit wonky or if it's not the exact size that it says to trim it up to in the pattern. Mine was just slightly bit off. But as you keep adding your triangles, you'll keep trimming and you'll be able to get it to the right size. No one's going to notice if the center is slightly bit off. But one thing to notice is that as you're sewing each of these, in quilting we always use 1/4 inch seam allowances. So sewing this 1/4 inch there, once I press open, it matches right to the point of that square, and that's what you want. 1/4 inch there, right to the point. Okay, we're starting to get a nice swirl here now, building a nice little S shape. And as I said, you'll trim each time you're adding these pieces, and I tried to give you leeway for mistakes. I mean, it's best to stick with 1/4 inch seam allowances, but since there is a little bit of trimming off, so far it's been pretty tiny. But there is, I've made these triangles a little bit larger than needed so that you could hide your mistakes with trimming. One tip I have for trimming this shape is whatever size the pattern says to trim it to, line up, try at least to line up these 2 points with the midpoint of that. And then when you turn it, same thing there. It doesn't always work, but it's a good guideline. Okay, now for the next set of triangles. And on we go. As we get bigger is when I give you a lot more leeway. This here is quite a bit. We want this to be 1/4 inch on each side, so we can see that we're probably going to trim off close to 1/4 inch. And that way, if these little parts are wonky, this part's going to be perfectly square. Okay, as I said, we've got a decent amount trimmed off there. So you may not be able to trim very much off when it's the small center in the middle, but as we go outward, you'll have more to trim, which means you get to make it look more perfect. And again, our S is getting bigger. Okay, next layer. Next pair of triangles. I'm going to orient it this way so that my green is always on the left when I attach a green. You'll notice I'm lining up the point here roughly in the center. Like I said, with these bigger triangles you have a little bit of leeway, so if you don't have it exactly in the center, it's not the end of the world. I'm lining up there and then just moving it into place. And then moving to my sewing machine. You can pin if you like. And I just want to check up. Again, the point is matching up pretty well there. My point is matching up pretty well there. That one there is a tiny bit off, but it's not a big deal. No one's going to notice. I'm going to press these open and keep going. I'm going to demonstrate pressing these open real quick because I like to use my wool pressing mat and my tailor's clapper to get my seams really nice and flat. So I will hold on this side for a little bit. Maybe I hold longer than I should, but I just like to make sure they're nice and flat. And then hold my tailor's clapper on it. And then while that's still resting on, I'll open the other side, make sure it's smooth, and press it as well. I got a little wrinkled. Hold the tailor's clapper for a little bit. That's still a little bit warm. Sometimes I like to flip over to the cool side to help cool it down, and that sets the seam even better. Do the other side as well. And another round. Green on the left, so green triangle goes here. Okay, one thing I noticed on this last round, my point doesn't quite match up there, but I think I know why. When I was trimming that square, I trimmed to the size, but I really didn't pay attention to whether that piece right there was a 1/4 inch margin. If I would have trimmed it, paying more attention to that, I would have matched up, because my seam allowances are the same, they're a 1/4 inch. But it's very slight. It's not worth undoing, in my opinion. Okay, now for the final round. Again, green on the left when placing the green triangle. Match it up with the middle, move it to the edge, and sew on the edge. Okay, so here we have the snail's trail block complete. I hope that these instructions were easy to follow. It really is just a square and a square and a square and so on. Just keeps going. But in order to create the spiral, we just use one single color on these pieces and a different color on these pieces. You could do a lot of different things with this. I think you could do one color here and a different color here. Let's see. You could do 4 different colors with this, possibly. I'd have to think about it. see if it works with that centerpiece. But there's a lot you can do with it. This is a real neat block. And again, you can download the pattern using the link in the description below. And check out my blog to see a few mock-ups I put together with this block, and also read more about this sampler set. Here's a mock-up of what my finished quilt will look like with all 12 of these blocks. Tune in next week to make block 8 with me. If you'd like to be alerted when each pattern is released, sign up for my newsletter by following the link in the description. And here are some images of the completed blocks I've made so far.